Of the OBX Wave Report. This is our Wednesday edition of the OBX Wave Report, a special edition where we look at what the climate scientists are talking about. And this is important to everyone living on the Earth. I don't know how much I can emphasize this, how much I need to emphasize this. I don't. Um, It's just we need to embrace the research that is going on now in the science because it affects everyone's lives. And it is important for all of us to keep abreast of this information because it is rapidly changing and it is essential information. It is just as essential as the daily weather report, and in some ways, even more so. So at the very least, what we can do here at the OBX Wave Report as people who live on the coastline, on the front lines of human-caused climate change, is talk about what the climate scientists are saying. What climate science indicates affects my life here on the Outer Banks. It affects my surfing here on the Outer Banks. It affects my prospects as a human being for the rest of my life. And it does have an impact on the weather that we see here on the day-to-day basis. So that's why we're talking about climate scientists here at a wave report because it's important. Okay. Um, and for this episode, it's a kind of like a weekly thing we do where we focus in on what the climate scientists are talking about. I've gone through the social media accounts of certain scientists that I follow, and I've teased out a general theme uh, of what the climate scientists are talking about today, and I'm going to provide you guys with that information and some of my meta-analysis of that information as we go. So thank you for joining me for this special edition of the OBX Wave Report and what are climate scientists talking about today on the interwebs in their social media accounts. Um, First off, I want to start with Dr. Michael Mann, who is talking about all kinds of things. Michael Mann is definitely on point when it comes to politics, very engaged in the effort to help clean up our politics by holding bad actors in our politics accountable. So he's definitely on point there. And that is important when it comes to climate action because we need to have good leadership in order to have climate action for the future and effective climate action. And when it comes to effective climate action, there has been a lot of talk about a recent breakthrough in ignition fusion using lasers to ignite a fusion reaction. And I've been waiting for this. The experts have now gotten a grasp of the data when it comes to this recent breakthrough in fusion energy. Early on, I did make a statement that the fusion breakthrough might be hopeful, but it's no silver bullet. And just this is the case with any breakthrough. Once you have a breakthrough, you got to go through all the steps of bringing a breakthrough to market. And there's all these barriers and hurdles and possible pitfalls along the way. And this is different, but from wind and solar, which are viable energy sources now that outcompete fossil fuels on a one-to-one basis. So there's always it seems like there's always people looking for a miracle solution. And don't get me wrong, research and development is a great thing, but whenever there's a breakthrough, it doesn't mean that there's a miracle solution. And the breakthrough does have barriers, following the breakthrough. The breakthrough is typically happens in the lab, and scaling is a major issue when it comes to deploying an energy source. Now, with a recent article in The Nation entitled "Nuclear Fusion Isn't the Silver Bullet We Want It to Be," things become a lot more clear. And first off, we find that there is right now a very high cost to gain a very small amount of energy from a fusion reaction. Um, so number one, the fusion reaction is nowhere near getting to a point where you're having a viable energy source, even though there is a scientific breakthrough there. And the other thing that jumped out at me from this article is the need for mass production of tritium to support these reactions if they do get to scale. And tritium is a problem. I mean, tritium is not clean. It's a very reactive hydrogen molecule that is damaging to the human body and can increase your risk of cancer. So there, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of wind turbines from morons, excuse me, but the word is moron, um, who say that wind turbines cause cancer. That's complete malarkey. That's bogus. Um, but in the case of fusion, there is a high risk coming from a particular molecule that you need for fusion, being tritium, hydrogen 3, which does cause cancer. So that's a concern. And then in addition, tritium is something that is potentially a proliferation risk as well, because it can be used for weaponization of nuclear compounds. So there's that one issue that could serve as a bit of a rock in the road. But then the other issue, which we talked about before, is the high cost right now of producing these ignition fusion reactions, which both of these seem to indicate, based on this article and to me, a very long time frame of development for fusion before it becomes viable, even if it does become viable in a safe kind of way. So I recommend that you read this article by The Nation called Nuclear Fusion Isn't the Silver Bullet We Want It to Be. We've got Arnie uh, Storignan making a post about it. Arnie's a clean energy expert. And then we got Dr. Michael Mann, who is retweeting Arnie's post here. And I just want to read the quote from Dr. Michael Mann. The reality is that fusion energy will not be viable at scale anytime within the next decade, a time frame over which carbon emissions must be reduced by 50% to avoid catastrophic warming of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So let's let that sink in for a second. We need to cut emissions by 50% over the next decade. And fusion's not ready. There's issues with fusion when it comes to safety, and there are serious issues with fusion when it comes to scaling. But right now, what we do have are viable energy sources. In fact, if these sources had been available, say, 40 years ago, people would have called them miracle energy sources. And right now, these energy sources are a powerful force in the world economy and have the potential to rapidly replace fossil fuels so long as we do the right thing and invest in mass deploying those sources now. And I do this. This brings me back to Katharine Hayhoe. Professor Katharine Hayhoe is an amazing voice when it comes to climate and clean energy, and has been on point, like laser focused on clean energy recently, and talking about the ins and outs of clean energy. And so um, I'm just kind of scrolling through some of her comments, talking a little bit about the Pebble Mine in Bristol Bay, and protecting fisheries, and retweeting another scientist, Stefan Ramsdorf, talking about the sad loss of a great scientist, um, Will Steffen, a courageous climate scientist who recently died in Canberra. But there's Project Drawdown. Speaking of sustainability. Okay, so, but the main thing I want to focus on that Professor Katharine Hayhoe is talking about right now in the social media is clean energy versus fossil fuels. And I want to highlight this post by Joe Smith. I need to follow him, a researcher on climate and energy policy, coal, utilities, and electrification. And so Professor Hayhoe is retweeting Joe Smith. Joe says every coal plant in the US is more expensive to run than building new wind or solar. Okay, let's like rewind and say that again in a different way. We're gonna re-paraphrase it, phrase it to drive the point home. Is right now less expensive to build wind and solar than it is to run an existing polluting, nasty, climate-killing coal plant. So why aren't we building the new solar and shutting down the coal plants at a faster rate? It is worth noting that we are closing down coal, but there's really no economic sense right now for running coal. And the reason is that clean energy in the form of wind and solar make the better economic argument. This is just truth. This is just facts. And those who are proponents of coal are just in denial of the facts, just as they are often in denial of what's happening in the climate system. So those preventing us from transitioning away from coal to wind and solar are preventing a better economic future for us, a better climate future for us, and a cleaner future when it comes to water and air. There's just no point in blocking wind and solar from replacing coal at this point, with a possible potential quibble of need for baseload, but that can be dealt with as well through various clean energy technologies that are available today. So just going on with Joe Smith, for 75% of coal capacity, renewable energy is much cheaper, offering a savings of at least 30%. New coal, and he provides a new coal cost crossover report. So there we go. Some good information about the ability of present clean energy to rapidly replace fossil fuels. And that's the kind of the assumption that I want to talk about, just going back to fusion for a second, is that for some reason the assumption is that wind and solar aren't good enough. And so we need this crazy fusion stuff. And the truth of the matter is, wind and solar are good enough. Wind and solar are the miracle that is happening right now. And we need these sources right now. They're the army we have, and they're a good army to fight against the climate crisis. They're not bad. The notion that they're bad, the assumption that they're bad, let's just explode that. That's just a bunch of BS, like bull pucky. All right, so let's go on. Katharine Hayhoe, retweeting Simon Evans, who is a energy and environment journalist, um, and a senior policy editor at Carbon Brief. Carbon Brief's a fantastic publication. All right, so looking at who is the biggest investor in fossil fuels, and right now it's North America. That's not good. That's I mean, imagine, so we're looking at this is in billions of dollars. So right now, this year, about $220 billion, or 2022, I'm sorry, $220 billion invested in fossil fuels in North America. Imagine that if that was invested in clean energy. We just saw some of the reports on the economics of clean energy versus coal. Why are we throwing good money after bad? Let's throw good money after good. All right, and let's see. All right, so this is the last thing that I wanted to talk about. This is on the last thing I wanted to talk about from Katharine Hayhoe's tweets, and this is the notion that global oil demand may have peaked in 2019, and this is very interesting. It is connected to the deployment of electric vehicles, and electric vehicles are a primary method for us to reduce carbon emissions over the next decade, as Dr. Michael Mann was pointing toward a need to do that. And let's talk a little bit about how we do that. It's primarily wind, solar, electric vehicles. And right now, on a positive note, it does appear that the mass deployment of alternatives to oil-based transportation in the form of electric vehicles are starting to drive a peak in global oil demand. And right now, we're seeing a lot of electric vehicles being produced every year, possibly in the range of, I think, about 8 million this coming year in 2023, maybe more. And this does have an impact on oil demand. And this tweet from Hannah Ritchie and the graph provided by her, and let's see, and this is a report from British Petroleum, and we'll see how this works out. But under the present scenario, global oil demand is expected to plateau through 2030 and then start to drop off. This is present pathway, what they call new momentum. But then if we start to get a little bit more ambitious and accelerate the transition to clean transport in the form of electric vehicles, we start to reduce global oil consumption even more. And this is kind of a big deal, but we really need to get on board with a rapid transition to electric vehicles to tamp down those emissions. Okay, and then Simon Evans again on January 31st. I did want to show you that for Europe, the top power source in 2022 were wind and solar. And this is again dispelling this kind of nonsense myth that we need something better. We really don't. We've got what we need. Wind and solar are amazing, and we've got ways to manage wind and solar that work. And the main thing that makes wind and solar so amazing is they are scalable. They're manufacturing based energy source, and they can very readily leverage economies of scale and innovation and breakthrough within the refinement of those energy sources as they go. And this provides a unrelenting process of reducing costs and increasing the gain from these energy sources. And this unrelenting process is what's out competing fossil fuels now. And right now in Europe, wind and solar are out competing. So you look at gas, hydro, coal, and bioenergy. Wind and solar are producing more. It overtook coal in 2019 and now is overtaking gas and nuclear in 2022. So the primary source for electricity generation in Europe is wind and solar, and it should be the primary source globally, both for economic reasons and for climate reasons. And this is something that Katharine Hayhoe is helping to highlight by um, promoting the tweets of a energy expert over at Carbon Brief. So follow Katharine Hayhoe, please, and follow Simon Evans. He is cool. These are some good infos. Okay, so shifting over to climate crisis, and I want to talk about a main indicator in the climate crisis. One of the canaries in the coal mine, as it were, is global sea ice extent. And what's happened to global sea ice is that the oceans are picking up a massive amount of heat. We've had record heat for the ocean system year after year after year. And the sea ice sits on the ocean. And so as the oceans warm up, it is logical that the ice will melt, particularly the ice that sits on the oceans. And right now, this should be a headline everywhere. Global sea ice is at record low levels. So this is a composite of sea ice in the Arctic, so in the northern hemisphere, and ice in the Antarctic in the southern hemisphere. Right now, the driver for this, if the previous post by Zach Labe, who is one of the world's best experts on sea ice, um, are indicative that this is primarily being driven by Antarctica, which is experiencing significant record low sea ice. And why should we be concerned about sea ice? Well, sea ice is an indicator of the ocean heat, which is one reason for concern. But for the other reason is that sea ice tends to act as a buffer for those glaciers that sit, particularly on Antarctica, right on the coastline and flow off into the ocean. So if you have less sea ice around those glaciers, then the warm water currents can come in and contact those glaciers and have more of a melting effect on those glaciers that sit on the coastline, these land-bound glaciers, though, that sit on the coastline. And then that extra heat can cause them to melt more. And those coastal glaciers buffer glaciers on the inside of the continent of Antarctica. So if those start to melt faster, they fall down like kind of like dominoes, and behind them there's this big mass of ice sitting on the continent, and that speeds up as it heads into the ocean. And you don't want that. You don't want that cascade of consequences from warming the global ocean. So this indicator is an early warning sign that the risk of that kind of event is rising. And what that means is that the risk of more rapid sea level rise is rising, which has an impact to all of us who live here on the coastline. So big deal right now with regards to global sea ice. Global sea ice is a major indicator. We need to pay attention to it. And the reduction in global sea ice is a clarion call for us to rapidly deploy clean energy and reduce emissions, as the climate scientists are saying, like Dr. Michael Mann, highlighting the need to rapidly deploy clean energy and reduce global carbon emissions by 50% over this decade. And here we have right here an indicator as to why, because we don't want those glaciers speeding up and hitting the ocean and raising those sea levels and drowning coastal communities like the one I'm sitting in right here. So yeah. All right. And last of all, let's go ahead and do Peter Gleek. Peter Gleek, great scientist. Follow him, please. Oh, and please follow Zach Labe. He is the best. He is the bomb when it comes to sea ice and the ice and the Arctic and the Antarctic and all of the things. Sea ice is very important. All right, so back to Peter Gleek, and Peter Gleek retweeting one of my favorite climate activists, Bill McKibben, amazing visionary, writes a great column. Read it. Follow Bill McKibben and follow Peter Gleek as well. Bill McKibben notes if we switch to renewable energy, this is back on January 7th, so I don't know how I missed this. I follow Bill McKibben. If we switch to renewable energy, the number of ships crossing the ocean would fall almost in half because they're just carrying coal, oil, and gas. And that's interesting too, from like an ocean sustainability standpoint. The less impact we have on oceans, the better off we all are. And it just shows you how efficient renewable energy is in the climate system if you're not having to, or in the human system as well, if you're not having to cart off these massive piles of crud, which is basically what fossil fuels are. I mean, it burns and it holds some energy, but it's basically crud. I mean, you can turn it into stuff, which is like what, plastic, which is crud in the ocean. And, plastic is bad. I mean, there's been these huge campaigns about plastic, right? Um, I don't really hear many people talking about where plastic comes from. Plastic in its present form, in the most polluting form, comes from fossil fuels. Although you can make plastic out of biological material, and that plastic tends to have less of an effect on an environment because it's not made out of crud. But in any case, um, yeah, great observation here by Bill McKibben that kind of circles the loop between sea ice and renewable energy and the need to transition to clean energy here. And the present, I hate to say it, distraction that is fusion, but it's just looking more and more like another distraction, at least for now, and possibly a dangerous one. It's I don't know what the fixation is with the dangerous distractions are, but we've got non-dangerous solutions in the form of wind and solar and electric vehicles, non-dangerous to your life and to mine, but definitely dangerous to bad actors. And you know what? Let's be dangerous to the bad actors and not dangerous to ourselves. And let's follow the climate scientists and do the dangerous things that are good for us and bad for the bad actors by switching to clean energy, meaning wind, solar, and electric vehicles. Let's deploy it. Let's put ourselves on a march to a better world and do the good things and be dangerous to the bad things and save our coastlines and have a good life for ourselves and for those who are with us. So thank you for joining me for the OBX wave report for this. Let's talk about what the climate scientists are talking about edition of the OBX wave report. And I